Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Educator Collaborative Gathering. It is one of my favorite days of the year as colleagues have the opportunity to learn all day from specialists in the field at home. What a great opportunity to snuggle in, turn on your computer, and get some new learning. We are thrilled to be here today and are going to talk a little bit about social emotional wellness and share throughout the day. So if you have questions, please reach out to us on Twitter. Use the EdCollab Gathering hashtag, and please feel free to tag me, Kristin Ziemke, so we can see your tweets and respond to your questions as we go. I am thrilled to be here today with my brother, Kirk Ziemke. This is our first time collaborating in a public setting. Kirk shares a lot of ideas with me from the secondary school setting, and we discuss things all the time, but this is our first opportunity to be on camera and live sharing with you. Kirk is a physical education teacher. After a couple of years of teaching, he returned to school and went to the Chicago School for Psychology. And as he came back to his school, he was really noticing that stress and anxiety among teens was on the rise. And so at that time, Kirk started doing some research, looking at wellness in kids and mindfulness, and created this really fantastic curriculum called the CARE program, which stands for Coping, Adaptation, Relaxation, and Empowerment. And he has a very unique program at his school where he partners with the school psychologist to run this curriculum that teaches kids positive mental mindsets, how to be resilient, and a number of other things that we're going to be sharing with you today. So welcome, Kirk.
Thanks. Glad to be here. And this is Kristin Ziemke. I'm sure you've seen her before. She's a resident teacher at the Big Shoulder Fund in Chicago, which works with a network of schools in high-need communities. And she does a lot of educational consulting, and she's a pretty good sister on top of that.
Oh, that's nice. So not only welcome to the EdCollab family, but welcome to our family. This is so fun. Okay, so we're gonna get started here and wanted to invite you as we go today. We're going to ask you to do a little bit of writing. So please make sure you have some sticky notes or some scratch paper readily available. We're also gonna ask you to do a little bit of snacking. So if you could take a moment and maybe find some small snack food that you can eat as we go this morning, that would be fantastic. So let me switch over and share my screen with you guys. Let's see here. All righty. One more time, I'm gonna try. There we go. All right, hopefully you guys can see this. Here's our contact information, where to reach us on Twitter. And then today we've created a resource page for you that we hope to add to throughout the day. So take a look at that and know that there are gonna be some additional resources there. As I shared with you, Kirk is the creator of a program called CARE, and this is, I think, a really unique approach to bring whole child development into the mix, especially in middle and secondary schools, and looking at what aspects of physical education and emotional well-being, how we can explicitly teach coping strategies, and how we can partner with other entities within the school to really build a curriculum that's supportive and intentional and suited for what our students need. So we're going to talk about a number of these things as we go today. But I think first we have to start with the where we are now and why, right? So regardless of the initiative, whether it was, Common Core or Park or Race to the Top or No Child Left Behind, the push for academics has been very prevalent in the last few decades. And so we've brought more and more academic rigor into our classroom settings. as kids progress through their school career, once they enter middle and high school, we now add a whole suite of extracurriculars on top of that academic load. We then start talking about grades and the importance of grades and how getting good grades will get you into a good college. But grades aren't enough. You also need to have accolades and awards in order to get there. And what we, believe is that we find ourselves today in this place where we haven't taught social emotional wellness. And if you look at any classroom across America and many around the world, we can see that this is something our kids are calling out for. If you look at the language of the Common Core State Standards, and Smokey Daniels made me aware of this piece, these are words that are missing from the Common Core. And I think, when we look at teens and when we look at the developing brain, these are some of the most important things that we need to teach them, not only to be effective learners, but to be effective citizens as well. And so we think about some of these elements and then look quickly at the data, right? Why teach social emotional learning in our classrooms? Well, what the research has found is that when kids are explicitly instructed in social emotional learning, they show an 11% academic gain. So why not teach this, right? If we know that we can get a 10% achievement gain from students, that's another signal why. If you've read the news or turned on the television, we quickly see that there is a lot of stress on teens today. And frequently we minimize that as adults in saying, like, kids will say to us, oh, you don't understand what it's like to be a teenager today. And adults minimize that and say, we were teenagers once, we get that, we understand, but it's really quite different with an interconnected world and with the ever-present use of technology. Kids are aware of more situation and feel the pressure to succeed as well. Just a couple more interesting statistics that we found as we did this research. From 2005 to 2015, clinical depression among 12 to 17-year-olds is significantly on the rise. That's quite a jump in a short 10-year period. We also see that 25% of adolescents will suffer from a major depression incident by the time they exit high school. And it just absolutely makes sense that this impact of depression and the moment where we are able to leap over barriers to academic engagement, leap over interactions that might inhibit us from succeeding in school. This piece of social emotional learning is for sure present. And so let me just click back here really quickly and show you just a couple more things. And so what we're really looking at with this piece of the why is that we know that teens are stressed. We first have to be aware and acknowledge it. And then as an educational community, we have to think about next steps to mediate it and to make it better. Dr. Daniel Keating has found that there are 3 factors that promote resilience to overcome the effects of stress. And 1 being strong social connections. 2, acquiring the habits of mind for mindfulness. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. And then 3, intentionally taking care of the physical body. And he refers to schools as creating a culture of compassion, and that's a school-wide effort and something that we absolutely need to address. And we know this from whole child research and whole child development. We've spent many years focusing on the cognitive aspect of schooling. We've added some physical in there, mostly through extracurriculars, a little bit through physical education classes. And in just the last decade, we've started to push the creative and shout out for the importance of that. But we've really failed to address the social emotional piece. And I think that's where our efforts need to lie for the next couple of years intentionally and intensively. And so our schools look a little less like this and start to embrace principles along these lines. And Kirk, do you want to talk a little bit about these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, social emotional learning is working with kids to develop mindfulness, and the progression that we take through that is first to develop mindfulness of their environment, from simple acts like focusing in on what you're eating or what you're drinking, into going on. We take mindful walks kind of through the school, then through the community surrounding the school, and we try to be aware of what's surrounding us, and things as simple as what the temperature is, what the sun feels like on our face. Is it a strong breeze or a light breeze? Things like that. And then from there we move on to mindfulness in thought, and then mindfulness in the emotions that our thoughts create. So from there, we move on to kind of talking about self-care, and we try to teach the kids to be mindful of what they're doing on a daily basis to take care of themselves physically and mentally.
And so I think we've identified, as others have, of course, but there are 5 key components when thinking about this mindfulness and culture of care at a school. And the first component would be mindfulness. Then we'd follow that with metacognition, move on to self-compassion, really dive deep and touch into empathy and how to define that, and then move into the next aspect of taking perspective. And so we're going to start a little bit today with this mindful piece and talk about some of the ways that we can intentionally teach this in the classroom. And so let me go back to the screen share and have you share a little bit on what this mindfulness aspect looks like.
Yeah, I think mindfulness is basically awareness, and it's being aware, like we said, of your environment, and then moving on from there to thoughts and emotions. But the way that we introduce mindfulness to students is we start off at a base level, and we really do start off with an exercise that's snacking basically, and we break down that exercise kind of to its core. If you think about grabbing a grape or eating a bowl of cereal, we pretty much just wolf it down, and we're not very conscious or aware of taste, texture, things like that go along with the act of eating. So we just go to a really simple form, and we have the students, we bring in grapes for our students, and we have the students eat one grape, and we actually time them, and they have like an interval that they have to eat that grape in. So it's a 30-second interval, and first off you have to put the grape in your mouth for 15 seconds and just kind of feel the texture before you bite into it. And then from there, after 15 seconds, you have to chew for 15 seconds before you swallow the grape. So we're just slowing things down and just trying to enhance awareness of the simple act of eating.
So we would like to invite you to try this with us this morning. Kirk is going to kind of coach us through the steps, and if you had the opportunity to grab a snack, we're going to do the 15-second exercise, and then really think about the descriptive words that we would use for us. So now's the time to grab your snack. What are we going to do the first 15 seconds?
The first 15 seconds, you just take what is your snack going to be?
I am going to have a raisin.
All right, a raisin from a trail mix pack. So
I should have chosen the M&M, but I chose a raisin.
That's a good call. But anyways, for 15 seconds, you're just holding the raisin in your mouth and kind of like feeling the texture, feeling some of the taste with it. And then the second 15 seconds, you're chewing for 15 seconds before you actually finish eating the raisin.
Okay, so ready?
Ready, and you're off.
Join us.
And you can start chewing. And you can finish eating the raisin.
Okay, so for those of you at home, quick 30-second, right? Describe that experience. What did you feel? What did you notice? What jumped out at you? What are those descriptive words? Just a quick bulleted list. If you want to join us and share your descriptors on Twitter, that would be even better. I'm going to do a quick write right here.
All right. So what descriptive words did you come up with?
With my raisin, like the first thing I felt was that it was wrinkly.
Okay.
And then it tasted sweet. It was hard too, which was something that I hadn't necessarily expected. Maybe this trail mix has been in my backpack for a long time. I don't know. But then as I started chewing, it was even sweeter, and it was like a little bit of a sticky texture. And by the end of that 15 seconds, it had pretty much disintegrated.
And that's kind of what we're looking for. You know, on an everyday occasion, you're not going to put a lot of thought into eating one raisin, but, you know, breaking down and starting to dig into mindfulness, you know, we start very basically, and like we said, we're focusing on, you know, developing mindfulness of our environment.
So what this makes me think of is really teaching students to have a close awareness of the world around them. In our classrooms, we're really familiar with teaching close reading, and we go back and analyze the text multiple times to look at it through different lenses and to get a deep understanding of it. We might break it down and read only a snippet in order to go really deep and slow it down. And I think those are the strategies that you're starting to teach with mindfulness.
You know, and I think, you know, when it comes to reading, you know that, and we've all been through it. If you're reading a textbook, you get through 3 pages and you're thinking, you know, what did I just read? So, you know, there's a difference between reading and comprehension, and there's a difference between, you know, what you do on an everyday basis, living life and living a mindful life.
That's such a good parallel, right? Like, we know as educators that just because you can decode doesn't mean that you can understand it. With the mindfulness piece, we're doing it, but we're not really spending enough time to think about it. And so that's where we come in and have to effectively teach kids. So we've looked at this piece of being mindful. What's next after the mindfulness piece with students?
You know, after mindfulness of environment, we move on to mindfulness of thought. And, you know, we call that metacognition. And, you know, basically metacognition is thought on thoughts and awareness of one's thoughts. So, you know, what we're doing then is we're really looking to see, you know, what is our internal dialogue? What is our thought processes? And then we look into and we see, do we have any inefficient thought processes or any thoughts that create anxiety or create angst within us, and we try to identify those.
So a lot of times I know teachers say like metacognition in the classroom and reflect on learning. Is it just a simple reflection on learning, or is it more than that?
You know, it's a little bit more than that. I mean, it can be related to learning, but basically, you know, what we're trying to do is we're trying to be introduced to thought processes, like I said, that can be inefficient and that can lead us to be more likely to develop anxious feelings.
Okay. And so those anxious feelings might sound like?
Yeah, anxious feelings that, you know, that we'll talk about is we kind of define some inefficient thought processes, and examples are up on the screen now: catastrophizing, if-then thinking, overgeneralization, or black and white thinking are some of the things that we talk about. And like I said, basically what we do is we introduce what these concepts are to students, and, you know, catastrophizing would be basically kind of snowballing a problem. You know, I fail a test. That's not a good situation. And that's something that, you know, can be hard for a student to deal with. But that student is going to make that problem bigger if they catastrophize in their thought process after they get the results of that test. So I failed this test. Because I failed this test, I'm going to get a B or a C in this class. Because I get a B or a C in this class, my GPA is going to drop. I'm not going to get into my college of choice.
I know that I'm guilty of that from time to time as well, and you know, going through that cycle of thoughts.
Yeah, and I think we all have. I mean, it's a very common inefficient pathway of thought that all of us do. And what we want is we want to be mindful of when we start going down that path. And if you're mindful of it, you can redirect your thought process before that heavy anxiety kicks in.
Something interesting that you shared with me was this piece of humans and stress response via fight or flight. Can you talk a little about that?
Well, just in different classes that I've taken, and one professor in particular would talk about how humans are the only animal that can create the fear response when there's not a actual threat present. We can imagine that threat and activate our flight or flight response. And it's a
evolutionary trait.
It is. It's a great, powerful response that can be very helpful in a lot of situations. But if you have a constantly activated fight or flight response because it's being activated by inefficient thought processes, you're going to be more likely to have issues with some type of anxious thoughts or anxiety even.
So the idea in going through and naming for kids like catastrophizing and black and white thinking and if then is to give a name for it. And that makes me think a lot of like what we do in class, right? When I'm working with students in technology, they might have a great strategy to do something different. And I say to them, you know what you just did? You created a workaround. A workaround is when you find an alternate way to do the task because your original way wasn't going as planned. And so I do that so that they identify the word workaround, and then next time they employ that strategy, they're like, oh, this is a workaround. A workaround means, and giving kids names for these distortions, then hopefully that cues them to think about how to get beyond it.
Yeah, I think ideally, you start to develop an understanding of the link between thoughts and emotions. And, if I'm a student and I start feeling anxiety related to going in to take a test or, going into an athletic contest or anything like that, I can be mindful of the emotion, and then I can trace it back and see, all right, is there any thoughts that are inefficient that are maybe contributing to kicking up this anxiety? So, it's all part of being mindful, and it's all part of, like we talked about, thinking about what our thoughts are and learning to put ourselves in a position to, have as efficient of thought process as possible.
So you just made me think right there, and I hadn't had this thought before, but like in schools and in classrooms, how much time do we spend being efficient learners or being efficient with academics, whether it's the transition time between classrooms or eyes on text or number of reading minutes. We're monitoring efficiency in an academic context, but we're not monitoring efficiency in a brain development context. And so it makes a lot of sense that we start thinking about that.
Yeah, I think a really good mantra or something that students can learn is to ask themselves, is this helpful? And, if you're going to take a test and you're catastrophizing going into that test and freaking out about studying or, being prepared, if you're mindful of feeling that anxiety and you look and you ask yourself, is this helpful? It's a pretty easy question to answer because, being stressed out and freaking out is not a good way to go into any type of performance.
I'm seeing an anchor chart in my head right now. Is this helpful, right? And just like cueing kids back to that, to give them some routines for thinking. We teach them routines for comprehension. We also need to teach them routines for barriers that might impact learning, right? And we know that stress and anxiety has a direct influence on the ability to interact with new information and do so in a positive effect. So we've talked about mindfulness, we've talked about metacognition. What comes next?
From there, we go into monitoring our internal dialogue a little bit more in how we talk to ourselves and how we treat ourselves. And we call that self-compassion.
This was when you first started talking to me about this, maybe about 2 years ago. This was kind of an aha moment for me because I understood empathy, I thought, and I understood compassion, and I understood how to be kind, but I didn't understand the distinction between compassion and self-compassion. And self-compassion is a little bit of that bigger leap. There is a ton of great research on this. And so we're going to share a little bit with that, of that with you. And Kirk's going to talk through some of it.
Yeah. So, I think we all know about self-esteem, and for those of us who grew up in the 80s or 90s, and that's when we spend most of our time in elementary and high school, self-esteem was something that was driven into our brains. And self-compassion is something that's not new, but it's newer definitely compared to self-esteem. But self-esteem can be defined as how people evaluate themselves, and self-compassion, it can be defined as how people treat themselves.
And so I think the next piece of that is really looking at esteem, right? This idea of self-esteem brings judgment and comparison.
Yeah, self-esteem is kind of, it's an evaluation. So I'm going to judge myself against, other people, other performances, other, GPAs or anything like that. And that can definitely be a slippery slope.
Yeah, it can be destructive for kid thinking. A lot of the leading research on these pieces of self-esteem and self-compassion have come from Dr. Mark Leary and Dr. Kristin Neff. And so we have links on our resource pages to more of their information. But we're going to look at this piece of why do we move away from self-esteem?
Yeah, I think that there is, a few bullet points here, but I think for me with self-esteem is through the research by Dr. Mark Leary out of Duke University and Dr. Kristin Neff out of University of Texas, Austin. Like my sister Kristin said, they have so much resources online and great examples of their lectures and some TED Talks, and so you can really learn a lot from them. And I just think the information that they provide is great and a really good way to help students. But what sticks out to me with self-esteem, why I move away from it, is it can lead to an unhealthy desire of positive reinforcement, and it's controlled by external factors. So if I'm always looking, outwardly to be reinforced as a human being, that could be something that definitely could be troublesome. And I think anytime that you allow your self-worth to be controlled by external factors, that's a place that again can be a slippery slope.
Well, and I think it brings us back to some old school Alfie Kohn, right? We've talked about this piece of where does the reinforcement come from for decades now, and we are seeing it yet again play out in this piece of stress and anxiety in tweens and teens. And I think what was kind of a big aha for me was this last piece on the slide, that there's virtually no link between self-esteem and positive life outcomes. And so whereas that was touted for years and everybody got a trophy, we're now seeing that really didn't do much for the positive. In fact, it could have potentially been a detriment because we haven't taught kids what to do when you don't win the trophy, or what to do if, you're number 8 in your class instead of number 1. And so we're really moving away from this idea of self-esteem and moving towards self-compassion. And I think these ideas are ones that we really need to spend some time marinating in and thinking about, how does this apply to our teaching and learning settings?
Yeah, I think with self-compassion, again, it's how you treat yourself, and through the research, it's been shown that people who have high levels of self-compassion, they lead a more balanced, non-defensive reaction to negative or difficult situations. They're less likely to display signs of depression and anxiety. And for me, I think what's important when talking about students who may be feeling anxious thoughts or even depressive thoughts is that self-compassionate individuals do not compound difficult life situations by blaming, criticizing, or punishing themselves. So basically it's don't beat yourself up. It's, treat yourself like you would a dear friend or loved one. And if you do that, we're all going to experience negative events. We're all going to have setbacks, but we don't turn those setbacks into, huge problems through catastrophizing or beating ourselves up.
Well, and some of the research I read recently talked about how if you do follow those negative tracks of self-criticism or blame, those behaviors, because frontal lobe development is so key in the teenage years, those behaviors endure throughout adulthood in a high percentage of students that use that kind of talk. And so we want to take it head on, address it, and give some additional options to kids for their thinking pieces. And so a couple of activities that we would use to teach students would be, again, starting with role play, right? What are some common school experiences that may lead to an internal dialogue that lacks compassion? Kirk, can you talk a little bit about that and how you do that with your kids?
Yeah, I think that it's a really great way to get students engaged is you have students pair off into groups. They're given a situation. I failed the test. I missed a big shot in a basketball game, and you have one student who verbalizes in front of the class an internal dialogue that they would have that lacks self-compassion. So, you're an idiot, you're terrible at math, you're a horrible basketball player, ways in which you could beat yourself up when you have a negative experience. And then their partner then would role play a internal dialogue that reflects self-compassion. So, it's just one shot. There's another game next week. You didn't do well on this test, but that doesn't mean you're a bad math student. You can figure out a way to do great on the next test. So, kids can get up in front of the class and really act it out. And that just, again, identifies what a self-compassionate internal dialogue is. And hopefully it helps students to be more mindful of if they are lacking in self-compassion in their internal dialogues when they face, issues that all kids face as they go through their school years.
And one thing that you taught me in terms of teaching self-compassion is that you teach kids to treat themselves like they would a friend, right? And to use the same language that they would use with a friend. And so I think after this role-playing situation, the next logical step would be like, okay, so let's chart out some of those things, right? And so I started to make a little chart to share with you guys today. I hope you can see this, right? But what would compassionate responses be? So if I was saying something along the lines like, ugh, I got a D on that test and it's going to totally bring my grade point average down. Now I'm worried that I won't be able to compete in the athletic event. And if my GPA isn't good, then how will I get into a good college? And if I don't get into a good college, then how will I have a happy life?
Yeah, and that's kind of catastrophizing. Lacking self-compassion would be more like, I didn't get a good grade on my test. I'm a absolute idiot. I'm worthless. I'm a failure. Those types of things. So that
the internal
that tears you down. And it turns like we said, it turns a negative event like a bad grade on a test into something much more if you're beating yourself up on top.
So if I said, I got a D on my test, I'm going to fail Spanish. I don't feel good about my role in school. I hate myself.
Those types of things are definitely lacking in self-compassion. And then what that does from an academic standpoint is, if you tell yourself that you're a failure and you're worthless, it's going to sap your motivation to study for the next test. If you say it's a bump in the road, I'm better than that.
So that would be some of the language that we would chart with kids, right? Compassionate responses could be things along the line like, bump in the road, right?
Yeah.
What else?
Something that it can be really simple is, hey, you're good. Let's move on from this.
Right. And I like the way you said, let's move on, because then that symbolizes togetherness, and it gets back to that positive community that kids need, those top three things, right? You need to be surrounded by positive responses to those negative feelings. And so I think making a simple chart would be very easy to do with students. It's something that can hang in the classroom and that they can reference when they are feeling that they're having that dialogue of negativity and beating themselves up. Let's go back to some of the notes and the slides that we have right here real quick. All right.
Yeah, just real quickly, another activity that we do is we kind of searched around pretty deeply to find some sort of documentary piece or piece online that you could watch and really create a feeling of compassion within yourself. So we found this documentary, The Boatman. It's about a couple in Louisiana who've been together through thick and thin. And
we're not going to make you watch it now because we don't want you to cry.
It's a tearjerker, but you really can't help but feel compassion at the end of this documentary for these two people. And so then what we do once that feeling of compassion is triggered, we shut the movie down, we shut the lights off, and we do a real quick, 2-minute meditation where we ask students to take the external feelings of compassion that they have for this couple and turn them inward, because, we all deserve a high level of compassion. So we try to bring the compassion out through the viewing of the documentary, and then allow students to, reflect on that and try to turn that compassion that they feel for this couple towards themselves. And
video is a great affordance in our classrooms. And so really thinking about how can we bring video that is intentional into our teaching practice, right? We refer to that as a mentor tech model, just like we use mentor text to position kids in books that make them think or styles that they can write upon. We use mentor tech as a way to invite kids to think about these big ideas of self-compassion. And this video of The Boatman is linked on our resource page if you want to go ahead and use that with students. So we're moving into self-compassion. We're really being thoughtful about that. What comes next, Kirk?
From there, we dive into empathy.
Empathy is, one of those hot topics right now, and as it should be, right? We could all use a little bit more empathy in our lives. But as I think what happens all the time, when terms become mainstream, it means something different to everyone, right? Just like we say Reader's Workshop, that could mean 1 million different things depending on who you are. So what we would like you to do is with us, just jot down a quick definition of what empathy means. And don't Google it, right? It's tempting, we're all online, don't Google it. But how would you define empathy for your students? We're going to give you a couple quick seconds to do that. If you're joining us on Twitter today, please take a moment and tweet out your definition on empathy. And I'm going to spend some time writing my definition right now. So quick write, what is empathy? All right, so I see a couple of responses coming in here on Twitter. Empathy is the ability to feel for a person in a time of struggle. Empathy is taking another perspective when something bad happens. Empathy from, I can imagine feeling what you all must be feeling, right? And so I think diving into this definition of empathy is really worthy for students and teachers. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Kirk?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think, what we see is that students or just individuals in general, not students, but adults as well, associate empathy with sadness or, a negative experience or a bad outcome. So, you broke up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, I'm going to empathize with you and, feel bad with you and those types of things. And that is empathy. But, the definition of empathy is the ability to understand and share feelings of another. I think what gets lost in there is that, that's sharing feelings, which can be both positive and negative or happy or sad. So I think it's important for students to be mindful that they're empathizing with their classmates and friends, positive feelings as much as they're empathizing with their negative feelings.
Well, and I think we've talked about this with the media, right? Like, look at what the media puts out there in terms of negative responses to empathy, or all the stories that get the clicks and receive the attention are often those negative stories. So we haven't done a good job balancing or modeling what positive empathy can look like. Common Sense did a great survey on kids in the news just last year, and what they found was that kids responded that when they see kids on the news, it's in response to something negative. And so we need to give instances of those positive ways to respond to empathy more and more.
Yeah, I think like anything else, it's just about balance. And you don't want to promote empathy and have students or individuals constantly seeking negative situations because they're looking to empathize. So it's a two-way street. We want to make sure that lane towards empathizing towards positive emotions is also open.
So really, I think what we need to do is expand the definition of empathy, make people aware that it is that two-way street. And so we've talked about empathy. Empathy also leads us into perspective, and how can we take perspective for another's issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that perspective taking is an important skill for all of us to have, and that's a good way to open up that second lane of empathy is you can take perspectives on, all right, well, this is something bad that happened with my friend, but what is something that is good that has happened, and you change your focus from the negative to the positive. So one way that we try to change perspectives is, regardless of what's going on in that day, we ask students to write down 3 good things.
And 3 good things is one of those practices you may have seen on social media, to be reflective on what good did come out of today, right? We can all find some good that came out of today. And so we would like to invite you today, as we wrap up, to identify 3 good things. Again, if you're joining us on Twitter, please tweet those out and share with the community. But it's a way for us to move away from, this was the worst day, to, oh, you know what, in the intricacies, there were a lot of good things that happened today. So Kirk, what was one good thing that happened to you today?
I got to work with you. That was great.
Oh, that's nice. I'm sure that mom and dad will love that one. One great thing about today was that this is one of my favorite days of the year, the Ed Collab gathering, where teachers come together all around the world and share practice and have practical strategies that they can bring right back into their classroom and try on Monday. And so we hope that in our time together today, we've been able to share some ideas that you can try right away with students next week, and to give them some strategies for thinking. Along with the 3 good things, we next, coach kids to have sort of like a mantra or a short phrase that can remind them how to get back to the positive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
A mantra.
Well, you know how you said you have one that you share to yourself when you're feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with perspective taking, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at it. And I'll reflect on, if I say something, I find myself saying, this is terrible, or this is the worst. And then I try to take a step to the side and say, well, you know what, your grandpa and great uncle fought in World War II, and they made it through that. So if I'm stuck in traffic on the way home from work in Chicago, is this really the worst? And the answer usually is that it's not. So that change of perspective, gets me out of, the stress or anxiety that I'm facing with being stuck in horrible Chicago traffic.
So the perspective is a big piece. So we've talked about a number of things. Our resources are going to be available online, and we'll follow up via Twitter with further questions. But I think, we focused on a lot in our schools over the last couple of years, but now, we really need to focus on the head and the heart, and to keep our kids and their well-being and their mental health at the heart of what we do in our decision making forward. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope you have a couple things that you can try right away. Our resources are available right on we'll share them at the end, and I'll tweet them out. And I'm going to turn it back over to Carolyn.
Well, thank you, Kristin and Kirk.
And Carolyn, we would like to thank you for being our tech support. You are the best at this, and we're so lucky to have you joining us, even though it's God only knows what time for you.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. It's always great to learn with fabulous presenters from all around the world, and teaching us today to keep perspective and to have a mantra and power through with mindfulness in the classroom. Thank you both today for that fabulous presentation. We're looking forward to those extra resources. So we will be following Twitter and hashtag the EdCollab Gathering, hashtag session 2 to get those extra resources from Kristin. Before we end this session, I wanted to just share with you guys the upcoming fabulous presentations that are coming up. We have Kate Roberts going to be talking about transferring learning from one learning experience to the next. That's going to be workshop number 4. Workshop number 5 is Trisha and Kim talking about teach this, not that, disrupting texts in the secondary classroom. And then we have Deborah Lynham talking about dyslexia in workshop number 6. So please do stay tuned for that. And we hope to see you in the next session. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Kristin.
Thanks.
All right, we're off the air. You guys were awesome.
Thanks
You guys are so good. Yeah, Twitter was active. Everything was great. And you will be live on air now. I'm going to sign out. I've got to jump into another one, okay?
Bye, friend. Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.